Hi, I wanted to add a supplement to Chapter 2, and what we're going to focus on in this lesson is principle-based ethics. This is an approach to ethics that your book doesn't highlight in the chapter when it looks at different secular ethical theories, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't take a look at what principle-based ethics looks like. So this is supplemental. There's a handout on PowerSchool on the Chapter 2 page, and I will give you a purple copy of the handout in class. So if you're absent, make sure you get the purple handout. I'll show you what it looks like in just a second. Okay, so the learning objectives for this lesson are down here. We're going to look at just these two in this particular lesson. The principles-based ethics approach. So, and we're going to learn the 4 common principles. And after this lesson, you'll be able to define what principle-based ethics is, as well as list 4 common principles that we can use to go about the business of principles-based ethics. The vocabulary that we're going to be looking at is principle-based ethics. We'll look at 4 common principles of principle-based ethics. Okay, so this slide has a bunch of different vocabulary words here, and you'll notice that in the definitions they kind of repeat the words over and over again. But I think the first place we'll start is over here with values. So as it says here, values differ across cultures due to the fact that individuals in specific cultural groups share similar experiences and thus accept similar values. Subgroups within cultures can share different values. There can also be a diversity within different contexts. Additionally, values are the foundations for the formation of norms, standards, and principles. So that's really the key point here, is values represent shared ideas in a culture, and even every individual within a culture can have different values that they accept. And so values are, generally speaking, bigger ideas or more broad in scope. So for example, when we talk about a value, we might talk about valuing human life in general. So we could say that, at least in the context of Catholic culture, one of the fundamental values that we look at is the value of human life in general. Then from values, we can then take a look at principles, accepted or professional rules of action or conduct, fundamental or primary general laws or truths from which others are derived. And this is really the key in principles. It continues fundamental doctrine or tenet, descriptive ruling, opinion, accepted as true across a specific context, and are intended to guide practice. Principles are not just guidelines for reaction when something goes wrong or when a dilemma is found. And so principles are a little bit more practical, practical when compared with values. But they're, unlike standards, they're still kind of foundational. So they're fundamental or primary general laws or truths. So for example, a principle that we have in the Christian life is the golden rule, or the principle of beneficence, that we should do good. And this is based in the value we place on human life. Now, standards and principles are pretty similar. As it says here, approved model morals, ethics, habits established by an authority, custom, or individual as acceptable. They support the implementation of normative principles, benchmarks to assess quality quality of evaluation. So standards seek to make norms more consistent across the board, and they reflect shared values. So for example, if we look at, say, bioethics standards, the Catholic Church has standards for bioethics that we use in a healthcare setting that come out of our value for human life, but it tries to make sure that across the board in Catholic healthcare ethics, there is consistency in that our values and our principles are reflected consistently in standards for bioethics. Finally, there are norms, and they're defined as a standard model or pattern that guide evaluators' work, shared rules or ideas about how people should act or behave in specific contexts. So norms are also based on values, shared ideals, rules about how people ought to act in certain situations. So we see that ought there. When we think of things that we ought to do, that's where we get into the questions of morality. So in some of the standards, formal agreements, the more concrete norms are reflected in lieu of higher values. So norms are expressions of our values based in our principles, and they tend to be expressed in by way of rules. So for example, the 10 Commandments are norms of behavior. They tell us, based on our value for life and the principle of, say, the golden rule, do good, what would that look like? It would mean something like no murder. And so you can see that these different terms are all kind of related. Let's take a look at the next slide to sort of see a way that they relate to one another. Okay, so this slide kind of shows the way norms, values, standards are related. So values are kind of the basis here. And as they show, each person has their own values. And from our shared values as a community, that leads to basic guiding principles. And from those guiding principles, we develop agreed upon standards to guide us in how we behave. And from these standards, we have specific norms, specific rules of behavior. Sometimes standards and norms tend to be pretty similar, and you tend to use the terms sometimes interchangeably. But the general idea here is we're going from a more basic, broad, and foundational ideas to more specific and more delineated ideas. So you start with general values like valuing life. That leads to principles like the golden rule or the silver rule, do no harm. That leads to different standards. And typically we see these standards, an example would be like bioethics standards in a hospital, and those lead to various norms of behavior. For instance, in Catholic hospitals, one of the norms is that they do not provide an abortion. So this is what principles ethics is, based ethics is all about. Okay, so this is from the handout I gave you. It's the purple handout I gave you in class. I'll show it to you on the next slide. But principles-based ethics bases ethics in shared principles that we can all agree upon. And Tom Beecham and Jim Childress identified these 4 principles that are a common set of moral pillars in moral life. And so the first one is respect for persons, or in other words, respecting people's autonomy. So this principle acknowledges a person's right to make choices. So that's why we have that with this chapter. We've been talking about rights. to hold views and take actions based on personal values and beliefs. And that's where the autonomy comes in. It's the idea that I am an autonomous individual, and my right to make my own decisions needs to be respected. The next principle is the principle of justice. So the idea that others should be treated equitably, and we should distribute benefits and burdens fairly. Then the next is the principle of non-malfeasance, which in the Christian tradition we might call the silver rule, but it means we have an obligation not to inflict harm intentionally, or in the terms of medical ethics, the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath is that a doctor should do no harm. So, or in terms of the silver rule, it's the idea that you don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. And then finally is beneficence, or the golden rule. And this is the idea that we should not only not do harm, but we should do good. So provides benefits to persons and contributes to their welfare, refers to an action done for the benefit of others. So these are 4 broad principles we can use to guide our actions. And so some of the let's take a look at some of the contributions and some of the benefits of principles-based ethics by looking at the handout on the next slide. Okay, so this is the handout that I gave you as a supplement to the textbook. So here are our 4 general ethical standards. And as I was saying, these principles basically are things that pretty much everyone can agree upon. So unlike deontological ethics, where everything was based in categorical imperatives that you can never violate, or consequentialism or utilitarianism, where you were only looking at the outcomes, principle-based ethics starts from the standpoint of general principles that are the foundation for the way you act and behave. And so it draws on pillars that are part of American life that everyone can pretty much agree upon. And it's compatible with both outcome-based and duty-based theories, because these principles can be applied across the border. Is that the right expression? Across the board. It's, as it says here, provides useful and fair and fairly specific action guidelines, but they're not too specific. So unlike a categorical imperative where you get kind of hemmed in, with principle-based ethics, they are specific yet flexible. And they offer, especially like in a healthcare setting, they offer, it says here, offers an approach that's appropriate for general bioethics and clinical ethics, and it requires weighing and balancing they're flexible and responsive to particular situations. So, for instance, the idea of do no harm, if we can look at that basic principle, and if you're, say, in the medical profession, you can use it to decide what the ethical thing to do is. And so, for instance, when you have a bioethics question about, say, an ectopic pregnancy, that's when you have the fertilized, I think it's called a zygote at that stage. The fertilized egg gets trapped in the fallopian tube. And so what should a physician do in a case like this? You can use these principles to help guide your actions. So we know that one of the principles that most people would agree upon is that you should do no harm. But in this case, one has to ask, what is going to be harmful, and compare that with what is going to be good. And particularly in healthcare ethics, these general principles can be helpful in making difficult decisions. And later on this semester, we're going to look at specific biomedical ethical situations, and we're going to take a look at the Catholic Church's use of principles of bioethics to make ethical decisions in healthcare. But they can be applied just to life in general and other ethical questions. Once you have your agreed upon set of principles, then you can ask yourself, are my actions consistent with these principles? And if they're not, then that gives you an idea of what you should and should not do. So this is one of the benefits of using principles-based ethics as opposed to other approaches.